Hello everyone, my name is Sarah Thornburg and today I will be presenting my admin management project. My management and leadership simulation is going to cover understanding protests and how to manage them. To begin, it is important to have an understanding on what a protest is. And essentially, protests are events that occur as a result of a group of people feeling strongly on a subject, enough so that they organize a sort of rally in order to broaden understanding on the matter, influence public opinion, urge for action to be taken on a legislative level, or simply to find more people who feel passionately on the same subject that they do. Why do protests occur? The answer is a multitude of reasons, really. The First Amendment protects the right to assemble and express concerns through protest. Especially since the death of George Floyd, protests have become more common and, sadly enough, have become increasingly more violent in nature. Violence being present at a protest is a cause for concern as far as public safety goes. While the First Amendment does protect protest rights, it is important to understand that these protests cannot infringe on the liberties of other citizens without the need for some intervention. The ways that law enforcement chooses to conduct themselves when managing protests can have negative effects on the relationship between public and law enforcement. Because of this, it is vital for protest managers to understand protesters' cause or motive, respect the participants, even if their views are not entirely in line with their own, and make public safety a priority at all costs. For my research on this topic, I looked into 5 research articles that discuss different protest management techniques. My objective is to assess the data that they present and determine which techniques are most effective for protest management and which ones need alteration before satisfactory results can be achieved. In the article Understanding Community Protest from a Project Management Perspective, a Relationship-Based Approach by Melissa M. Teo and Martin Loosemore, they focus on establishing strong, trusting relationships between law enforcement and protesters before the event occurs. To test this, they implemented theories of social identity, social capital, and social networks on an Australian protest aimed against a construction project that was going to destroy a long-standing protest establishment. This protest coincides with another protest, which goes against the artifacts that will be destroyed with the construction as well. The data was collected through randomized and snowball sampling with interviews that ask questions about protest network characteristics, patterns of communication, and personal experiences/stories within the protests. The results were monitored through a data collection process. Looking at this diagram, you can see where researchers examined the patterns that the crowd made. Leadership roles within the group were interchangeable, allowing participants to take breaks when they became burnt out. Since everyone has one common goal in mind, it makes this interchanging possible. The core group acts as a glue that ties networks together and keeps participants motivated over time. The results found that a sense of collective identity was established within the crowd. The participants viewed themselves in a close-knit manner. A few quotes from the interviews taken that show this are from Activist W. It is like a family, you can't stand some of them, but you are still family and you still have the same aim, like a love-hate relationship. From Activist I, it is kind of like a big extended family after a while. And from Activist C, you wanted people who understood the issues, who were there for the right reasons, who were supportive, and could do some work, and who would help. Additionally, a social capital is observed to exist within the crowd. This keeps everyone familiar with one another and makes great use of networking in order to attain resources needed for the event. Some quotes from the interviews that show this are from Activist W. Some people give technical advice, some people give legal advice, people help according to their skills and knowledge. People have basically volunteered that they are prepared to help on issues. There are some legal people here, and they have stood up and said that they would help. From Activist V, I have the union connection, so if, for instance, anything needs to be written to the minister, that's where I come in. I use the group as an instrument to get to the minister because, in a way, it has more credibility, unfortunately, than the community front. For my overall assessment of this article, I found that protest participants exist under family-like conditions and with large networks that aid in its success. It is vital for protest managers to present themselves in a manner which does not go against this. They should build strong, understanding relationships with their participants to ensure they see that no threat is present. Protest participants feel strongly about their cause, so if protest managers threaten to shut down or silence the protesters, things are more likely to get ugly. The answer to ensuring a peaceful protest is to coincide with their behaviors, in a sense, join their family/community, so that if things get ugly, they do not view you as an outsider shutting them down, but rather a member of their community who is simply instilling management techniques that would keep them safe. It is vital, vital, vital for protest managers to show that they are instating regulations to keep the protest going and not to shut it down. In the article From Negotiated Management to Command and Control, How the New York Police Department Polices Protests by Alex S. Vidal, researchers observed command and control techniques used in protest management within the city of New York over a 6-year time span. For the sake of time, I will only talk about one of the protests in specific, which is that of the anti-Iraq war demonstration protested on February of 2003. In this protest, theories of zero-tolerance policing, quality of life policing, broken windows theory, and problem-oriented policing were enacted. The techniques implemented rely on aversion to disruption, controlled access, divide and conquer, shock and awe, and zero tolerance. For this protest in specific, law enforcement were non-cooperative by denying them a march permit, deploying thousands of police officers, severely limiting access to the demonstration, charging crowds with horses, and making hundreds of arrests. The results of this found that attempting to microcommand and control the demonstrations had negative consequences for police-community relationships. For protest managers to present themselves in a non-understanding manner will only greaten the tensions and worsen relationships in this aspect. The protesters felt ambushed and like their freedom to protest was being stripped away from them, so they reacted in a violent manner. They recognized that law enforcement had little to no respect for them, and so they reacted in an equally disrespectful manner. My personal assessment of this article is that when protest managers refuse to level with the crowd, protesters will get angry. They had already had to overcome a lot of burdens to make the event happen, so their patience was running thin from the beginning. The command and control techniques resulted in a lower level of respect between the public and law enforcement, which can be hard to undo. Reacting in such a way resulted in the protest becoming increasingly violent in nature and put the public in harm's way in the process. I did not find this method to be an efficient technique for protest management, at least not how it was enacted here. In the article Preparing for Action, Police Deployment Decisions for Demonstrations by Nina, Rudd, Pauline, and Stefan, the researchers emphasized that protest success will result from steps taken by law enforcement before protests. They considered a multitude of observations in this study, including the actual protest request, mostly a letter by the organizers, the decision by the police to grant permission or not, including the department's plan of action to police the event, the number of police deployed to the event, resource availability, and officer experience. Their objective was to establish what precautions and steps taken prior to a protest yield the most satisfactory results. The results of their implementations found that protests with police who have had previous protest management experience aided in getting an understanding on the level of potential violence posed by an event prior to the event's occurrence. Protests that prepared by having an excess of officers and resources yielded more readiness in the event that the protest did get out of hand. And finally, protests in which permissions/permits were granted to the protest participants without issue resulted in more peaceful protests all around. For my personal assessment of this article, I found that having officers with experience preview a protest and determine the potential threat posed by said event prior to the actual protest can be beneficial in getting all of the law enforcement on board. It allows everyone to know exactly what could happen and prepares them for how to react in that situation. Preparing by having more officers and resources than may be necessary can be beneficial because in the event that the protest does become violent in nature, there are already officers ready to go and handle the situation immediately. Cooperating with protest participants from the beginning can be beneficial in having them go into the protest with a positive and respectful mindset towards officers. If they have issues getting the permits that they need, their attitudes will already be negative from the beginning, and it is more likely to provoke violence within the crowd. In the article Dialogue Police Decision-Making and the Management of Public Order During Protest Crowd Events by Hugo, Clifford, and Michael, the researchers urged that communication is the key to adequate crowd control. The researchers implemented a bunch of fives, developing 5 reasons why a certain police action makes sense, promised police actions, we said that we would do this and now we're doing it, deliverables, we can do this for you, to a study called Obelisk, which lasted 3 days. Their biggest management factor was to exist in a no-surprise manner which told protesters exactly what would occur as events unfolded. They collected data by conducting interviews with the participants and officers during and after the event. The results found that there was immense success with this strategy. There was little to no violence reported. Officers laid out their expectations and detailed exactly what would occur as a result of not meeting them. Thankfully, no members from the crowd pushed their luck with going beyond what officers deemed acceptable behavior, so no acts of force were required from law enforcement at this particular event. For my assessment of this article, I found that being open in communication to the protest participants yielded great success and should continue to be a tactic used in future protest management. Protesters felt respected by officers and knew exactly what their limitations were. Being able to see what is exactly expected and what is not acceptable behavior makes acting accordingly that much easier for participants. Hearing exactly what would occur if a certain line was crossed made it to where the crowd would not be taken by surprise if action had to be taken. I agree with the implementation of this tactic on a national scale for future protest management scenarios. For the final article, I looked into A Kinder Blue, analyzing the police management of the Sheffield anti-Lib Dem protests of March 2011 by David Waddington, which emphasizes the implementation of liaison officers and what they refer to as a social media cell. This implementation worked to depict security in a better light. The theory they used is communication-oriented. The liaison officer acts as a buffer between the actual police and protesters. The social media cell has members within it working and ready to respond to discussions or concerns that appear on social media such as Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, etc. I found this especially interesting because it recognizes that issues can arise just as easy virtually as they can physically. The results found that protest managers reported to feel a higher sense of security with the implementation of liaison officers. Officers were able to reason more with the participants and understand the passions that were fueling the protest. Liaison officers kept tensions to a minimum between law enforcement and protest participants by having participants confront them with any concerns instead of going straight to actual law enforcement. The social media team kept themselves up to date with the protest concerns via the internet and worked to address them quickly, and doing this kept the record straight. For my assessment on this article, I think that the liaison officers were a great addition to the protest. It assured protest participants that there were people there on their side and that they could be contacted with any concerns. Liaison officers took some of the weight off of the officers' shoulders, making it easier for them to focus their efforts to the truly troublesome members of the crowd. The social media cell ensured that information on the protest was kept up to date and that people outside of the event were aware of the true occurrences within the protests. With so much fake news articles, the social media cell was a great addition. All in all, with this tactic used, protest participants felt more safe, secure, and understood within the protest with the addition of these new tactics. Now that we have discussed the data, I believe that the best approach would be a combination of the communication-oriented approach and the Kinder Blue approach. Protest participants simply want to feel understood and heard in their protests, so finding approaches which appeal to their needs will make the overall presence of protests more acceptable in nature. My favorite implementation is that of the liaison officers because it appeals to everyone's best interests. Protest participants are able to address their concerns without confronting law enforcement, and law enforcement are able to focus their efforts to more serious matters. Implementing these tactics can have positive effects for the relationship between the public and law enforcement, which, as discussed earlier, can be hard to do. The only barrier I see with this implementation is the struggle it could be to get everyone on board with this. Since relationships are already damaged between law enforcement and the public, it will have to be corrected before, and the tactics I have presented will be effective. To conclude, I would like to present a few application questions to you. What risks are posed by not having adequate protest management techniques? What can be done to strengthen relationships between law enforcement and protest participants? And finally, what is the most effective approach to protest management in order to ensure public safety is prioritized at all costs? Thank you.